Thank you everybody for joining the Bridgeport Library for this event, H.P. Lovecraft in New England. We're excited to have S.T. Joshi here to talk about Lovecraft. He is a leading authority on H.P. Lovecraft, Ambrose Bierce, H.L. Mencken, and other writers, mostly in the realm of supernatural and fantasy fiction. He has corrected editions of the works of Lovecraft, several annotated editions of Bierce and Mencken, and has written such critical studies as The Weird Tale and The Modern Weird Tale. His award-winning biography, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, has already become a collector's item. An expanded and updated version, I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft, was published in 2 volumes in 2010. And he'll just give us a little introduction to Lovecraft's life and work before we talk about Lovecraft in New England.
Yeah, it's always good to be here, and I'm sort of I like to think of myself as sort of an evangelist for Lovecraft in a non-religious sense, but I like to spread the word about this most interesting writer. I guess most of us know he was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, at that time, his parents were not, because that's where his father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, worked. It's hard to explain what he was. He was what is called a commercial traveler, which is not a traveling salesman as such, but because he sold wholesale, really. Worked for Gorham Silversmiths, which was a long time Providence jewelry outfit. Anyway, if things hadn't happened, Lovecraft probably would have become a Massachusetts resident. But things did happen. Specifically, his father in early 1893 was on a business trip in Chicago and took ill somehow and was brought back to Providence, not where he lived, but he brought back to Providence in a straitjacket. What happened was that apparently he had syphilis. So he was, and they didn't know how to treat syphilis at the time. They didn't even really know what it was, but he was brought back to Butler Hospital in Providence. It's still there. You can see Butler Hospital to this day. It is an insane asylum. They thought he was just insane, and they just stuck him in there. Didn't give him much treatment or anything. And so 5 years later, he died in 1898. Well, this unfortunate circumstance caused Lovecraft and his mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, to bring Lovecraft, the boy, back to the family Phillips home in Providence, Rhode Island, at 454 Angel Street. And that's where Lovecraft grew up. And he was, just enraptured by the city from the moment he became aware of his surroundings. He was a precocious boy. He studied, he started writing at the age of like 6 or 7, little stories and poems that still survive. Started studying chemistry about the age of 8, maybe, astronomy at 11. Actually started publishing astronomy columns in the newspaper around the age of 16. So he was really, really very precocious and, a prodigy of sorts. His formal schooling, however, was quite irregular. He had all sorts of nervous troubles that kept him out of school for long periods of time. So he only had a couple of years of elementary school and just a few years of high school, Hope Street High School in Providence. In fact, in 1908, after only 3 years of high school, he basically dropped out because of some nervous problem, and he, for someone who so valued the intellect and reading and books and things like that, it was deeply humiliating to him to not even graduate from high school. Couldn't go on to Brown University, which was really on his doorstep right there in Providence. So shamed, and he spent the next couple of years. Well, we don't even know what. It's a kind of a blank period in Lovecraft's life. He probably just read a lot of books, was trying to study his science as well as he could. He had a nice, telescope and things like that. But he really wasn't doing much of anything. He got out of this in 1914 by joining a movement called amateur journalism. Now, what this was a formal organization of people around the country who wrote stuff for little magazines and printed them up themselves. It was really a venue for people to practice printing, because at this time a lot of people had their own little printing presses right in their homes, and this was a way to get some work done on printing. But Lovecraft saw this as a way of getting his material out to a small but appreciative audience. He was, at this time, in his early 20s, very unsure of himself, didn't have much confidence in his abilities. So starting to write for this small audience was, I think, helped boost his morale, because he was welcomed by these other amateur writers who admired his writing. He wasn't writing much fiction at this time. That changed in 1917. He was 27, and then he started slowly writing, the stories that we now know. A lot of these stories did get published in these amateur papers. Very rare now if you can find any of them. He really liked the amateur movement because it validated his own perspective on what a writer should be. A writer, in his judgment, should write for self-expression, not for money, not for fame, not for getting your stuff out there to as many people as possible, because he didn't think that most people were intelligent enough to understand what he was writing, and he was probably right about that. So it was, non-monetary self-expression is what he set as a goal throughout his whole life. However, in 1923, a professional market for his work did open up with the founding of the magazine Weird Tales. Now, Weird Tales was what is called a pulp magazine. A pulp magazine of that era meant that it was printed on a very poor quality paper. It was basically the paper that was left over after the people had made good quality paper, and that's why it was very cheap, and therefore these magazines could charge a dime, 15 cents, and basically it was material for the populace, shall we say, the masses, if you will. Over the course of the 20s and 30s, there were hundreds and hundreds of pulp magazines of all different sorts in very many different fields. Science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery, romance, you name it. Actually, in horror, Weird Tales pretty much was the only field, only magazine. There were a few others briefly, but Weird Tales lasted for decades as really the only magazine solely devoted to horror fiction. And so Lovecraft, inevitably published his work there. But they'd only paid a penny a word. It was not exactly a lucrative market, but he didn't have much choice anywhere to publish anywhere else, because by this time the mainstream magazines, Saturday Evening Post or Atlantic Monthly or whatever, were not publishing horror fiction anymore for reasons that are too involved to go into, but they didn't feel it was serious literature, and so they just weren't publishing it. So Lovecraft had to publish in these cheaper pulp magazines. By this time, interesting developments had happened in his personal life. Specifically, his mother died in 1921. She herself had been put into Butler Hospital. She had a nervous breakdown in 1919 for various reasons, and was stayed there until she died in 2021. And Lovecraft obviously was very upset by that. Now his kind of last link to his parents, all that was left now were two elderly aunts, whom he was close to indeed, but only a few weeks after his mother died in 1921, he went to an amateur gathering in Boston and met Sonia Green. Now, Sonia Green was a Jewish immigrant from Ukraine. All hail to Ukraine. She was from Kiev, I believe. Had emigrated first to England and then to the United States. She'd been in the U.S. for at least 20 years or thereabouts. She was in her 40s, about 7 years older than Lovecraft. But they struck up a friendship, because they felt they had some sort of intellectual rapport at least. And basically they conducted what we would essentially call a long distance romance, because Lovecraft's there in Providence and she was there in Brooklyn, New York, working at a pretty executive position at a department store. She was a milliner, a hat maker. Made a lot of money, pretty good salary, but she would visit Lovecraft on business trips, into New England, try to look him up as much as possible. And so by the early 1924, they decided to get married. And so Lovecraft moved from Providence to her apartment in Brooklyn. Well, that sounded good on paper because here Lovecraft was in the mecca of New York publishing. Had lots of opportunities, you would think. Well, sorry, that's my phone. Pay no attention to that. But Lovecraft was not successful at establishing any sort of position, either freelance or salaried at a publishing company or magazine or anything. He couldn't find any work. Sonia herself lost her job for reasons kind of involved, but so all of a sudden the couple, freshly married, didn't have a lot of money. And I'll tell you from my own experience in living in New York, I lived there for 17 years. New York is not a good place if you don't have much money. So they were in a lot of trouble. Sonia, at the end of 24, had to go to Cleveland to work. I don't know why she couldn't find a job closer to home, but no matter, she ended up at a big department store in Cleveland, leaving Lovecraft basically alone in Brooklyn, in a city that he now had come to hate because it was, as you can imagine, very different from Providence. Providence then, and to some degree even now, is kind of a safe, quiet backwater. It's not a huge megalopolis the way New York is, and Lovecraft was suffering this incredible culture shock being in this massive city. He did have friends, of course, a lot of good friends, but they only went so far. And you can tell from the letters he wrote in 1925 to his aunts. He painfully chronicles, all the stuff was going on in his life, and he was getting really, really depressed. It was just not where he wanted to be. So finally, in the spring of 1926, his aunt said, "Howard, just come back to Providence." What that basically meant was, forget this woman you married and just come back. I don't think they ever liked Sonia. They thought she had taken him away from them, which is true enough, I suppose. And they said, just cast her aside and come back. And basically Lovecraft did that. I mean, the marriage was basically over. But Lovecraft was back in Providence, and I tell you, he flowered over the next 10 years of his life. I mean, he was so happy to be back in Providence. In fact, one of his friends, W. Paul Cook, who lived in Vermont, came down and saw him. And Lovecraft, I should mention, was a great devotee of cats. He loved cats. And Cook said, he was so happy that if he had had the proper apparatus, he would have purred. He was he just loved being back in Providence. It was home to him, Now, having this base of operations in Providence, and with his aunts looking after him, and to some degree he looking after them, he felt at liberty to do a lot of traveling up and down the eastern seaboard. Lovecraft was very fond of old places, partly because of his grow up in Providence, where you can trace the history back to the 17th century. I'll get into that a little more later, but he loved to look up old places all up and down the eastern seaboard, all the way north to Quebec, all as far south as Key West, Florida, and all sorts of places in between, whether it be Charleston or Savannah or Richmond, all these lovely old towns that are on the East Coast there. And in the interim, he wrote. Not a lot, but he wrote. By this time, his conceptions as a fiction writer had expanded to the point that he was writing long stories, and not very many of them, because it just wasn't his thing to churn stuff out like that. The stories he was writing at this stage are what came to be called the Cthulhu mythos. Now, what that means is stories about these so-called gods. They're really not gods, but they're extraterrestrial entities like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and Nyarlathotep and Azathoth and such, who come down from the distant reaches of the universe and interact with a few unfortunate human beings. The basic theme or underlying message of these stories is what Lovecraft called cosmicism. What he meant by that was that he was attempting to show the vastness of the universe and the inconsequence of humanity within the spatial and temporal gulfs of the universe. As an atheist, he did not believe that the universe had any meaning or direction, and that we human beings simply don't matter. We are only of importance to ourselves, not to the universe at large. And in my judgment, the stories that Lovecraft wrote during that final decade of his life are probably the most powerful expression of this idea in the entire history of literature. And that really gives him his standing as a writer in literary history. He did venture out, as I mentioned, to these travels, but he also was communicating a lot with different writers and other people too. Lots of different writers. He tried to help them with their own work, and they were very grateful for that. And so he developed very strong bonds of friendship just through writing letters, and we still have thousands of these letters, and they're incredible documents, I'll tell you. In some ways, to my mind, even more interesting than was fiction. But as I say, he never wrote a lot, and in this pulp magazine world, you couldn't make a living unless you churned out the stuff in quantity, and he just couldn't do that and didn't want to do that. So as a result, he was descended further and further into poverty. Also, his health gave way in the mid 30s. He had a very bad diet. He didn't know how to eat well, and so he developed cancer of the small intestine. That's fairly rare. Colon cancer, obviously, more common, but it does happen. And he also had some kidney troubles. So in late 1936, it was looking pretty bad for him. He went to the hospital in March of 1937, Jane Brown Hospital in Providence, and died on March 15th in great pain and suffering, but there was. So he was dead. He's lived only 46 and a half years. He did not have a single book of his stories published in his lifetime. He had done some negotiations with some publishers, Alfred Knopf and Putnam's and people like that, but it hadn't happened. Nothing came of him. And so his friends, who didn't really know how ill he was, were staggered by his death and said, "Good Lord, we can't let all his great stories just, rot away in these crumbling pulp magazines. We got to publish them in book form." And two people, his friends, August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, founded the publishing company of Arkham House for the sole purpose of publishing Lovecraft's stories in books, and they did. And gradually over the decades, Lovecraft became more and more popular, especially in the 70s. His work got out to a lot of people in paperback. And today, here we are, not quite 100 years after his death. And now Lovecraft is this incredible figure of world literature. His stuff has been translated into 35 languages. It's been adapted for film and television and comic books and role-playing games and every other medium you can think of. In my estimation, I cannot think of a single author in the entire history of literature who was so obscure in his day, had very little, visibility during his own lifetime, but who has become such an incredible figure around the world. That is only one of the many different things about Lovecraft that is distinctive, and we can go on from there.
Okay, so about New England. Thank you for that introduction. So Lovecraft lived most of his life in Providence, Rhode Island. What did Providence mean to him, and how did he use it in his fiction?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to spend 6 years in Providence. I did a bachelor's and master's degree at Brown. In fact, I went to Brown for the sole purpose of kind of, advancing my own study of Lovecraft. I discovered in high school, and they have a lot of his books and manuscripts and papers there at the library at Brown. But I got to know Providence real well, and I could see what Lovecraft saw in that town. It's, as I say, it's quiet. It's not the most intellectual town in the world, but Lovecraft didn't care about that because he had lots of friends to whom we can discuss things, intellectually. But what Lovecraft liked about Providence was this sense of continuity from the past to the present. That's what he liked about any old civilization. The notion of continuous existence from, say, the 17th century all the way up. Another thing he liked about it was, again, from this atheist perspective, he knew, as everyone I hope does, that Rhode Island itself was founded in opposition to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Roger Williams was a Baptist, which was a relatively new denomination at the time in the early 17th century, had come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony from England. Didn't like the Puritan theocracy of the colony there, and so he left down in 1636 and established Rhode Island and Providence as more or less a haven of religious liberty, religious freedom. One of the first such places, I think, in the entire Western world. He deserves great credit for that. He welcomed, Quakers and Jews and even Native Americans. He had his dealings with the Native American tribes there was honorable, unlike many other Americans over the years. And so that Lovecraft really looked upon Providence as a kind of a haven of sanity, at least in the 17th and even into the 18th century. As distinct from the Puritans. Not a lot of them, but some. The first one I think we can talk about is the Shunned House. The Shunned House is an actual house still standing at 135 Benefit Street. Lovecraft knew something about the history of the house. I think one of his aunts actually had lived in that house briefly as a housekeeper or something. But what is interesting is that he wrote that story in New York. In the fall of 1924, he was so already feeling such homesickness for Providence that he started reading up books about Providence to sort of, at least absorb himself mentally back into the city of his birth and try to forget about this place called New York. And so he wrote this story. It's all about the whole history of Providence, going up from the 17th century today, focusing on this one particular house where sinister things are supposed to happen. He then expanded this idea hugely into a short novel called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Now this is interesting because we read in his letters that he was thinking about writing a novel about like the Salem witchcraft or something. But then he stumbled on a book at the New York Public Library called Providence in Colonial Times by Gertrude Selwyn Kimball. He had to read it at the library. He couldn't check it out. So he spent days reading the book at the library and was fascinated by the whole history of Providence, much of which he knew before, but, Kimball's book filled in a lot of details that he didn't know before. And so he shifted this idea to write about a sinister individual coming down from Massachusetts, Joseph Curwen, who was some sort of sorcerer or necromancer or something like that. Apparently, he's already discovered the secret of immortal life because he's lives far beyond the ordinary length of human existence. But he wants to do more than that. He wants to drag up the angels, gain as much knowledge from them as possible, and that knowledge will somehow allow him to, we don't know what exactly, but control the universe or something. But what Lovecraft does here is paint this incredibly detailed historical portrait of Providence in the 16th and into the 17th centuries. It is really a triumph of historical writing and incredible detail that he goes into in terms of the language and tales and all sorts of things that he got out of Kimball. So that's a great work, one of his best. Late in life, he wrote a story called The Haunter of the Dark. This was 1935. He had moved to a boarding house at 66 College Street, right at the sort of the apex of College Hill, from which he could look down over the downtown area to a region called Federal Hill, which then, and maybe even now, is kind of home of immigrants. And there was a particular church there called Catholic Church on Avenue that fascinated him just to really see it from his window. And apparently,
we're losing you a bit here.
Church, and this thing going, he wrote on, step right.
Looks like I think he'll just have to rejoin us. Got logged out. Okay.
I don't see a video here yet. I see something.
Okay.
Okay, here we are. Am I back?
Yeah. We're losing you a little bit there with the connection, unfortunately.
Anyway, well, we can just move on to the our next question. I think I covered that one pretty well.
Yeah, I would say I did get a chance to see the Shunned House when I was in Providence, and if you get a chance to see it, it's an interesting visit, and I saw it at night, so it actually did look pretty imposing all these years later. But
yeah, it's a 5-story building.
So many of Lovecraft's stories are set in Massachusetts. Why did he use that state from Boston to the Quabbin Reservoir and elsewhere as a setting for some of his greatest tales?
Well, I'll tell you. I mentioned that Lovecraft did have familiarity with Massachusetts. He lived there for a couple of years during his infancy. He probably doesn't remember that much, but he does have some memories from way back when. And of course, he visited many times. He got to know Boston quite well through lots and lots of visits, and also central Massachusetts. I'll get to that in a minute. But as I mentioned before, I think he looked upon Massachusetts from this perspective as a free-thinking Rhode Islander, and so he had a certain reservation about Massachusetts and its especially its Puritan history. In fact, I want to read you a passage from The Picture in the House. It was written in 1920. It's set in somewhere in Massachusetts, and he writes about this particular house, imaginary, of course, and he says, "In such houses have dwelt generations of strange people whose like the world has never seen, seized with a gloomy and fanatical belief which exiled them from their kind," that is from England. "Their ancestors sought the wilderness for freedom. They are the science fellows, but cowered in an appalling slavery to the dismal phantasms of their own minds," by which he meant this religious worldview that they had that dominated their thinking. So Lovecraft, regarded Massachusetts as almost sort of an other place, not quite right somehow, but nevertheless fascinating because it's all very old. Was when he ventured to Marblehead. Marblehead is a small town up on the North Shore, a little north of Salem. And he stumbled upon this place in late 1922. Hadn't heard about it before, didn't know much about it, and he was just overwhelmed by the antiquity of that place. And to this day, it is just a jewel of colonial architecture. I mean, it's just gorgeous. In fact, the houses are probably in better shape than they were even in Lovecraft's day. And he was just overwhelmed by feeling himself bodily transported into the past. It's something that he always wanted to do. And so about a year later, he wrote the story called The Festival, which is set in that there's walk through the city pretty precisely, some things, but you can tell where this narrator is going. Marblehead is not a very big city, so that's a jewel of a story, and really conjures up the atmosphere of old town Massachusetts. Another significant story, of course, is Pickman's Model. This is a story he wrote after he came back to Providence from New York. Set in Boston, both in the newer parts of Boston and the old parts. This artist, are we okay? Hearing some sort of static or something.
Mostly good. Someone in the chat, Horace in the chat, said with low bandwidth, because it says you have low bandwidth, sometimes going to audio only.
Okay, should I do that?
Yeah, I maybe try it just.
So I should say stop video. Let's try
that.
So I'll just speaking in a void here. I can see you. That's fine. Anyway, Pickman's Model is set in Boston. The artist resides in one of the older parts of Boston, the North End, which again, then and now is kind of the Italian district, and he has a little studio there. Of course, it's also where Copp's Hill Burying Ground is. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in the city, and strange stuff happened there. But Lovecraft, through Pickman, has some interesting speculations about the different parts of Boston and what they mean culturally speaking. He says this: things are out of place here and can't be conceived here anyhow. It's my business to catch the overtones of the soul, and you won't find those in a parvenu set of artificial streets on made land. Back Bay isn't Boston. It isn't anything yet because it's had no time to pick up memories and attract local spirits. If there are any ghosts here, they're the tame ghosts of a salt marsh and a shallow cove. And I want human ghosts, the ghosts of beings highly organized enough to have looked on hell and known the meaning of what they saw. So again, this contrast of old and new, and Lovecraft always prefers the old because that's where the sinister emerges. The color out of space is very interesting. This is written in 1927, and basically it takes the area of the Quabbin Reservoir as its locale. The Quabbin was begun in 1926, not completed till like 1939, but Lovecraft knew about it and must have read a lot of stories, newspaper articles about it, about the construction, because as you know, entire towns were evacuated and submerged under this huge reservoir. I've been there several times, and it's a spectacular sight. And so Lovecraft was fascinated by that. He set this story, The Color Out of Space, right there. The farms that eventually would, be flooded for a new reservoir in his story. But that story just uses that locale as a springboard for this cosmic, story from in the depths of space. That's one of his greatest literary creations, and really shows how Lovecraft was heading toward science fiction. In fact, it was published in a science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, in 1927. Yeah, Quabbin's a great place. Anyway, one of the next stories he wrote, The Dunwich Horror, is also set in central Massachusetts, a little in the southern part. He had an old friend named Edith Miniter who lived in Wilbraham, or Wilbraham as the town folks say, I think even now. And he stayed there for about 2 weeks in the summer of 1928. He picked up all sorts of local legendary that fascinated him. And so in this story that he wrote soon thereafter, he really goes into the legendary of this area of kind of rural Massachusetts. Another story, At the Mountains of Madness, has to be mentioned, not because it's set in New England, although it kind of starts there. It's basically set in Antarctica, but the climax of that story is where this horrible creature called the Shoggoth, which is this huge protoplasmic entity with shining lights all over the place, kind of pursues the narrators there. And one of the figures starts reading off the lines of the Boston to Cambridge subway line. I mean, he literally says, South Station under, Washington under, Park Street under, Kendall, Central, Harvard. I mean, that's the exact line you can travel today from Boston to Cambridge, because that character thinks that this huge Shoggoth looks like a gigantic subway train that's coming right after you. I mean, the imagery is incredibly powerful there. So yeah, Lovecraft, constantly went back to Massachusetts, but I think he used that as a sort of springboard for all these cosmic voyages that throughout the universe.
I saw that Pickman's model is going to be in the new horror anthology by Guillermo del Toro, so that should be interesting to see how that adaptation is.
It's been adapted a couple times. I'm sure some of us would probably remember the old Night Gallery adaptation by Rod Serling back in the 70s, which was not bad for its time, I
thought. So did Lovecraft ever visit Connecticut, and did he ever set any of his stories there?
He did visit Connecticut from time to time. In fact, he made it's kind of a cryptic early comment in like 1920. He says, "Oh, I've never set foot outside the states of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut." We don't really know where he went at that early time. Later on, he records going to Hartford. He goes through New Haven. He loves New Haven because, especially the old campus at Yale. In fact, he went there apparently in 1935 when some new quadrangles had just been built in kind of the old-fashioned style, of Oxford and Cambridge, and he waxed eloquent about the beauty of those of these new buildings at Yale. Otherwise, he really doesn't use Connecticut as a specific locale for his stories, although he refers to it every now and then. He talks about something, I think in Dunwich Horror, talks about something called the Moodus noises. Now, these are some sort of booming noises that were sort of based in the town of Moodus, Connecticut. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but they were elsewhere also. But Lovecraft didn't have any firsthand experience of them. He read about them in a book called Myths and Legends of Our Own Land. I can't remember the author's name, but he had that book in his library, so that's where he got the information for that.
Yeah, I have heard of those Moodus noises. Not actually sure where that is located in the state, but a small town. Lovecraft ventured elsewhere in New England, including Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Why was he so diligent in exploring these regions, and do they figure into his fiction?
Yeah, I mean, Lovecraft loved all of New England. I mean, he couldn't get enough of it. He felt it was such a distinctive part of the country, especially after he'd been all over the place in up and down the East Coast. He kept coming back to New England as kind of his home base. Although he knew that New England was a very different, in each state, in even specific regions. I think one of his most interesting stories is The Whisperer in Darkness. This was written in 1930 and entirely set in Vermont. Lovecraft had visited Vermont in 1927 and 1928. He had a couple of friends up there from the amateur journalism movement, and he was just fascinated because he felt that part of Vermont that he went to, which is the area around Brattleboro and Guilford and places like that, kind of embodied an older tradition of New England, that southern New England, with which had developed, had become sort of industrialized and mechanized, had sort of lost. Whereas these parts of Vermont still kind of clung to the old ways, the old rhythms of life, the change of the seasons and things like that. So he wrote a beautiful piece called Vermont, A First Impression, talking about his first visit to Vermont in 27. And then in 28, it's funny because he was enough of a celebrity after a fashion that he got ripped up in the local paper. I think it was the Brattleboro Reformer. Like literary gathering in Guilford, and then he talked a little bit about Lovecraft and some of his friends who were up there. But it took him 2 years to kind of absorb all the impressions from Vermont and then write this incredible story, The Whisper in Darkness, which is basically an epistolary story. That is to say, it's just about two people exchanging letters back and forth. One guy in Massachusetts, at Miskatonic University, in Arkham, Massachusetts, and this lonely recluse living up in somewhere in the Brattleboro area, and this guy describes these alien invaders that he calls the fungi from Yuggoth, these crustacean type entities that are kind of after him, and it's an incredible story, very rich in historical detail, but also in topographical detail, and also in this once again this sense of the cosmic, as these creatures have come from outer space and kind of plaguing this poor guy. So that's a fascinating story as well.
Lovecraft lived in New York for 2 years, from 1924 to 1926, but otherwise lived in Rhode Island. How did those years in New York affect his attitudes towards New England?
Yeah, growing up, whether it be in those very early years in Massachusetts or in Rhode Island. I think Lovecraft, those first 20, 20, 30 years of his life, kind of took New England for granted. I mean, he loved going around, went to all different places, whether it be Portsmouth or up all the way up to Maine at sometimes, all around New England. But I think he didn't fully understand what New England meant to him until he was away from it, and that happens all the time. I miss New England very much now. I love Seattle, Washington, but I do yearn for New England sometimes. But anyway, those horrible years in New York, they were really taxing to him. But I think they made him understand how important his New England heritage really was to him. When he came back, he was a transformed human being. I mean, he gained some sophistication from New York City. But he realized that New England was where he belonged, and it became more conscious awareness of both the topography and the history and culture of New England. In fact, as he was debating or discussing with his aunts where to relocate from New York, they had recommended, oh, why don't you go to Cambridge? There are more literary opportunities there. That might work better for you. Lovecraft said, maybe not. He said like this. He wrote a letter back to his aunts. To all intents and purposes, I am not more naturally isolated from mankind than Nathaniel Hawthorne himself, who dwelt alone in the midst of crowds and whom Salem knew only after he died. Therefore, it may be taken as axiomatic that the people of a place matter absolutely nothing to me except as components of the general landscape and scenery. My life lies not among people, but among scenes. My local affections are not personal, but topographical and architectural. I am always an outsider to all scenes and all people, but outsiders have their sentimental preferences in visual environment. I will be dogmatic only to the extent of saying that it is New England I must have in some form or other. Providence is a part of me. I am Providence. Providence is my home, and there I shall end my days if I can do so with any semblance of peace, dignity, or appropriateness. Providence would always be at the back of my head as a goal to be worked toward, an ultimate paradise to be regained at last. What a poignant utterance that is. That's, I took the title of my book from there, of course. And so when he came back to Providence, he said, yes, I am here. I belong here, but I don't necessarily want to stay here intellectually or imaginatively. I am safe here, but I can now voyage throughout the cosmos, and that's exactly what it does in his stories.
I liked in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where he has a nice quote about New England. He says, New England bore you, and into your soul she poured a liquid loveliness which cannot die. Talking to Randolph Carter, but I thought that was a nice little.
Oh, yeah. Both those stories, Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Case of Josh Exeter Ward, which he wrote one after the other in late 1926 and early 1927, testify to this incredible ecstasy that he felt coming back from New York to Providence. Both stories are basically, sort of symbolic of that return home. I mean, to him, you can return, you can go home again, and he did. And so they both sort of underscore that fundamental point that in his own imaginative life.
Lovecraft traveled up and down the eastern seaboard from Quebec in the north to the Key West in the south. Why did he undertake such long journeys to visit these places?
Yeah, I think Lovecraft, much as he loved New England, needed the constant stimulus of what might paradoxically be new old places. That is to say, he liked old places, but he wanted constant, a sense of discovering other places throughout the East Coast that he hadn't been to. He longed to go to England. I mean, he was a great Anglophile. He loved everything English. The Lovecraft side of his family did, in fact, come from England several generations back, but he never had the money to get to England. But coming down, if you go down the East Coast, you come upon all these great cities, Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore, Annapolis. He loved Annapolis. Washington D.C. He spent a lot of good time around the nation's capital, and all the way down to Richmond, Fredericksburg, Charleston. He thought Charleston was like a second Providence, and in many ways it is. I've been there, and it's very much very New Englandy in there, and he loved it there. And then all the way down to Key West, Florida, and other places. These places don't really introduce fiction very much, but there was one interesting point in At the Mountains of Madness. Now remember, this is a novel set in Antarctica, and the characters come upon this kind of enormous, I don't know what it is exactly, some big cliff or rampart or something. And the character says this: east, the low white line of the great ice barrier, rising perpendicularly to a height of 200 feet, like the rocky cliffs of Quebec, and marking the end of our southern navigation. So that visit to Quebec, which had happened only just a few months before he started to write this story, clearly stuck in his mind when he was writing this novel. So every now and then, interesting elements from his various travels do enter into this fiction, but mostly he was a New England guy.
And the last question here before we open it up to the chat. I think you mentioned a little bit this earlier, but Lovecraft published no novel or collection of stories during his lifetime. How did he attain such fame after his death when he was so obscure during his lifetime?
Funny you should ask that, because I wrote a book on this subject. Sorry, I set you up for that. Yeah, I just wrote a book called The Recognition of H.P. Lovecraft. It published a year or two ago, in which I kind of traced the whole history of and mostly after his death, of how he became so famous when he was so little known in his lifetime. As it began with those friends of his. It's amazing that August Derleth, important writer in his own right, wrote lots of books himself. Corresponded with Lovecraft for 11 years, lived out in Wisconsin, never met him, and yet he developed such a sense of loyalty to Lovecraft just from those letters. And it was he who spearheaded this the movement to get Lovecraft's work published in book form. Now, he didn't do a perfect job of it. He in fact made a bunch of mistakes, but that's okay. He got Lovecraft in book form, got the books reviewed by major magazines and newspapers, and that's how Lovecraft got a foothold in the literary world outside of the pulp magazines. Derleth also fostered the reprinting of Lovecraft in England in the 50s, and also the translation of Lovecraft into French and German and Italian. I'll tell you today, people overseas just cannot get enough of Lovecraft. I hear almost every day from somebody in whether it be South America or Asia or Europe or wherever, who wants to reprint Lovecraft because there's such a demand for it. I will mention that one of the first things I did at Brown University is that I started looking at the manuscripts of Lovecraft stories and found all sorts of horrible mistakes that Derleth and others had made when they published these stories in book form or in magazines. And so I corrected these texts in the 1980s, and now I'm fortunate enough to have these foreign publishers use my corrected texts to get Lovecraft's work out there to their own audiences, and that's so now both we in the English-speaking world and elsewhere in the throughout the world, as he wrote his stuff originally. Yeah, I think Horace was asking a question about Lovecraft's letters. I'll tell you, these are amazing documents. We are on track to publish 25 volumes of Lovecraft's letters. I've already done 20 of them, maybe 2021, and so only a couple more to go, and they might be finished next year. As for what proportion of letters, we don't really know. I mean, we have about 5,000 letters. The estimate is he wrote as many as 75, 80,000. Somebody conjectured 100,000. I think that's probably too high, but 75, 80,000 is a lot of letters. But those a lot of them don't survive. I mean, most people didn't probably keep his letters from Lovecraft because he was, he was an obscure guy. Well, what point is there in keeping these letters? His close friends did keep them, and so we have lots and lots of letters to his best friends, and they survive either in institutions or private hands or wherever. But yeah, you owe to yourself to read at least some of these letters because they shed so much light on not only on his fiction but on his own personality, his beliefs, the events of his life, and he turned out to be an astute commentator about what was going on around him. I mean, he was not a recluse in the sense that he paid no attention to his society. He knew what was happening in the U.S. and the world, and just are incredibly rich and well worth exploring.
And Tio says, I think you talked about Randolph Carter in your books. Is there a reason he keeps recurring while other characters do not, largely? Did he just grab audiences as much as possible, or was he a stand-in for someone?
Yeah, a lot of people think Randolph Carter is just a stand-in for Lovecraft. I'm not absolutely certain of that. I mean, in some cases he is, and clearly in the case of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he clearly is, because what Carter there is doing is he's a resident of Boston. He's a great dreamer, and he's looking for this sunset city of his dreams, and he can't find it. He's lost the key of dreams, and he has to go to the unknown Kadath, where the gods live, and try to beg them to allow him access to his sunset city again. Well, he gets there finally after a long series of tribulations. And what does Nyarlathotep tell him? You read part of that a little while ago. It turns out that this sunset city of his is nothing more than the memories of his own hometown of Boston. And for Lovecraft, what that meant was, yes, I belong in Providence. I mean, my sunset city is Providence, and that's where that's my home, and that's why I have to come back there. Like me is not entirely using Lovecraft himself as a stand-in. Some of them are just sort of Carter just becomes kind of a symbol. And one of the stories, Through the Gates of the Silver Key, is a collaboration that was kind of forced upon Lovecraft by his friend E. Huffman Price. I don't think he even wanted to write that story, but so that's what Carter ends up in 4 or 5 stories. I think it was sort of an accidental use of the recurring character, not really deliberate on Lovecraft's part.
Christopher says, you did the foreword to the Starry Wisdom Library, the catalog of the greatest occult book auction of all time. Given your closeness to the subject matter, were there any interesting choices or insights you may give about the book? Choices by the authors.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm not sure I read that book. I just wrote the forward to it. It's a joke book. You understand? It's a parody or it's a fake catalog of the imaginary books in Lovecraft stories and other stories as well. I mean, there's a whole library of books that Lovecraft and his created stories. It became kind of a running joke after a while, and actually gets kind of tiresome with this idea. And I think there's a second book in the works, or maybe it's already published. I think I wrote a forward to a second of something similar. It's all good fun. The Stool of Mythos, Lovecraft embodied some very serious ideas. Lovecraft does that from time to time. All right. Thanks to Horace for that comment. I have spent about 50 years studying Lovecraft, so I've been at it for a long time, and still more to go.
And Celeste says, since Lovecraft tended to travel around the East Coast, has he ever mentioned about visiting Pennsylvania at all? If so, where? And what were his thoughts on the state?
Specifically, I think he only visited Philadelphia, but he canvassed Philadelphia quite thoroughly. In fact, I think he took Sonia to Philadelphia on their honeymoon, such as it was. They spent a couple days in Philadelphia, tramping around the old parts of town. Let me think now. I don't really think he ventured a little farther out into the suburbs, some of the rural areas of outside of Philadelphia, but he didn't really have the means to travel much farther than that. But he loved Philadelphia.
James says, was the church on Federal Hill featured in Haunter of the Dark based on a real church?
Yeah, I did mention that. Maybe that was when I got cut off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was, Lovecraft would see this church called St. John's Catholic Church on Atwells Avenue in the Federal Hill district, or the Italian district of Providence. That unfortunately is no longer standing. It was torn down in 1990 thereabouts, I think, because it had a lot of structural problems, and the diocese just couldn't afford to rebuild it, so they had to tear it down. Luckily, however, in the 80s, I actually got into that church. In fact, actually kind of went up into the steeple at one point, which is where this monster is supposed to reside. It's really a very, very, interesting old church, old in the sense of, colonial. It's from the mid 19th century, I think, but it's unfortunate that it doesn't survive.
And Jeff says, are there any yet unpublished Lovecraft stories? Wasn't there a rumor of some unpublished Lovecraft manuscript being sold at an auction a few years ago?
No, it's not. It was not a story. It was an essay, I believe, that Lovecraft actually ghost wrote for the magician Harry Houdini. Lovecraft had some relations with Houdini in the 20s. He ghost wrote this one work of fiction that we know, called Imprisoned with the Pharaohs. Was published in Weird Tales, and we have that story. But it's an essay on astrology. Lovecraft, Houdini was a great debunker of pseudoscience, and he wanted Lovecraft to write this piece, and he did. Don't think it ever got published, and I think this manuscript is also incomplete. I've never seen it, so I think the guy who has it is kind of holding on to it. And then Lovecraft commissioned Houdini commissioned Lovecraft to write a whole book about superstition, but then Houdini died suddenly, and that book only survives in fragments.
Ian says, did any of Lovecraft's collaborative writings, like with Henry Whitehead on The Trap, take him to another writer's state or location for an extensive period?
No, I think whatever collaborations Lovecraft did were through correspondence. It is interesting that story, The Trap. I may plume myself in the sense that I was the one who discovered Lovecraft's contribution to that story. He mentioned it in a letter that was then unpublished, and I very early on in my life, my study of Lovecraft in the mid 70s, when I got to Brown, I started reading all the letters there, the unpublished letters, and I found this little mention that he helped Whitehead on this story. That story is indeed set. Is that set in Connecticut? Come to think of it, wait a minute. That might be a Connecticut setting. I'll have to think about that, because I think it's set in some school, a boys' school, and I'm pretty sure it might be Connecticut. That would be worth looking up. I can't quite remember. But Whitehead was living in Florida at the time. Lovecraft did visit him in Florida in 1931, but when they collaborated on this story, it was just by correspondence. And I feel that Lovecraft wrote probably the latter 3/4 of this story. You can see a fairly distinct change of style from Whitehead's style at the first couple pages, then into Lovecraft style. So really, he wrote the bulk of that story.
Don't see anything else in the. I just Ian says thanks. Do you have a favorite Lovecraft adaptation film like that's particularly accurate?
Oh, well, I mean, accurate is not, well, okay, yes. It's a German production, a film called, well, in German it's called Die Farbe, which means the color. Um, a brilliant adaptation of The Color Out of Space. Actually, it's all black and white except at the end where you see sort of the color finally appear. It is set in post-war Germany, in a post-World War II Germany, but that's good. That's fine. It really works. It's a beautiful, powerful adaptation. The director is actually a Vietnamese, a guy named Hoan Vu. Really superb job. It's out there. It may be a little hard to find, but I think you can find it. He wanted to do another Lovecraft film based on those Dreamland stories, Dream Castle on Kadath and several others, but apparently he didn't ever get the money for that, which is too bad. But because I think he could have probably done a good job. But that's a really fine thing. And there's some short films. There's one guy who did a music of Eric Zahn back in 1981, John Streisig. Superb, just really atmospheric and true to the story. Most other adaptations of Lovecraft, I'm sorry to say, aren't so good. They're neither faithful to the story, nor are they, good pieces of cinematography in their own right.
Christopher says, do you know much of Lovecraft's contribution to and his reaction to Robert E. Howard's segment in the Roundtable story, The Challenge from Beyond?
Well, Lovecraft didn't have any contribution to the story. Yeah, that was that's a round robin is the term. What that means is different writers write various chapters of the story. One writer taking off or developing it from what the people have done. And it was kind of complicated how this worked out, but Lovecraft wrote the third and kind of the most important and longest section of this rather silly story, and basically led the story in a particular direction. I think he was amused at Robert E. Howard's segment, which followed his directly, because this character that he has in the story was like this kind of an intellectual, suddenly becomes one of the kind of a tough guy, in the manner of Conan the Barbarian. I think Lovecraft was quite amused by that, but the whole thing was kind of a joke anyway. So I'm sure he found that pretty just entertaining.
Don't see any more questions in the chat. I think Jeremy. Oh, actually, oh, and James says Horace earlier asked what proportion of the many letters Lovecraft wrote are still exists. Oh, I think we've already. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think we talked about that. My estimate is about 80,000 letters. We have 5,000. So what's the percentage there? It's not a high percentage, So in a way, I'm glad more letters don't survive, because it would take generations of editors to edit them. It's already taken me 20 odd years to get this far. So I hope there are not too many more letters out there. Somebody was asking about where Arkham is. Yeah, that's a point of debate. But Lovecraft did believe Salem, both in its locale and its sort of general atmosphere. I mean, Lovecraft did visit Salem a lot, the whole witch stuff. Salem at that time, of course, did not have a university. It does now, but that was later. So Miskatonic University, which is in Arkham, is clearly based on Brown University, and you can tell there are a lot of parallels there to Brown, because that's the university that Lovecraft would have had most familiarity with. So in terms of the other cities, Innsmouth is probably based on Newburyport. Dunwich is based, on Wilbraham, that general area. Kingsport is based on Marblehead.
I think Jeremy wanted to say something.
Yeah, hi. Well, I wonder with AI these days, artificial intelligence, when you have a large data set, like Lovecraft's letters, with hundreds of thousands of letters, AI these days, people talk about, let's say on Twitter, how somebody, let's say, could be dead and they could still send out tweets, or you could have Facebook still post birthday wishes theoretically. You could get some sort of an automated system going on. And the bigger the data set that you can mine in order to produce something, the more accurate of a picture that you could get. So maybe, I don't know if you've ever thought of this, or maybe in a number of years when this gets more sophisticated, all the letters of his personal thoughts on everything, his essays, his stories, etc., people could eventually get a chatbot. So you could start very small with it, but then eventually he could theoretically live again in a digital form. And I wonder what your thoughts on that would be. If you could chat with him, and he would give the algorithm would figure out he would write it in the most Lovecraftian way, picking out all the exact vocabulary and stuff that he uses in his other thoughts, and then he could even opine on modern politics, he can make movie critiques and all sorts of other stuff. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Well, that opens up a whole frightening world. I just would want to make sure that these whatever gets produced in this manner doesn't actually get attributed to Lovecraft himself. I'll tell you, Lovecraft's total wordage in terms of his letters come to 4.5 million words. My colleagues and I have, in fact, digitized every single word of Lovecraft. I think just about it so it must come to 6, 7, 8 million words. We have it on our computers. Whether we'll actually get that out somehow, we're thinking about it. We'll probably get some sort of I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll probably get all those letters out in digital form somehow, and then you can at least do a search and find out every time you mention the word Eldritch or whatever. you could have a good time with them, but otherwise, right now we're basically just print editions and ebooks.
I think we have time for maybe one more question or two if somebody has any. Christy says, I think an AI thing like that sounds fascinating, but also creepy. And then Ian says, is it worth it today for a Lovecraft fan to visit New England spots he frequented?
Oh, absolutely. I think you get such a
I think we lost you there for a second. Oh. I think we lost him. Lost him here. Coming back in. Oh, okay. Okay, I think. Oh.
Am I back? I got cut off somehow.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You're back.
Okay. Let me just put my video back on just to say goodbye to everybody. But I think we're pretty much done, I would think.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thank you to
Yeah.
ST
Yeah, I had a
Joshi
great time.
for a great discussion here. And please be sure to check our social media for our upcoming programs, including a book discussion about the book United States of Cryptids with the author J.W. Oker. And thanks again to everybody for coming. Thank you, ST Joshi. And have a great night.
Yeah, good seeing you, everybody.
Thank you.